Dear ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the NYUAD Institute, it is my special pleasure to welcome you here tonight for our lecture on leadership and economic growth in the Gulf states. My name is Henriette Müller and I'm a Humanities Research Fellow here at NYUAD. I also have the pleasure of being the convener of the workshop on political leadership performance and economic growth, a comparative analysis of the Gulf region, Western Europe and Southeast Asia, that this keynote is a part of. Sponsored by the Humanities Research Fellowship Program of the NYUAD Institute, this workshop brings together scholars from all over the world to explore the mechanisms of how and to what extent different patterns of political leadership shape a country's economic growth in relation to its political institutional design. By focusing on three important regions with different economic histories and trajectories, namely the Gulf, Western Europe and Southeast Asia, we seek to compare the performance of political leaders across different institutional and cultural backgrounds, thereby contributing to a growing literature on comparative examinations of political leadership, economic growth and cultural studies. We are therefore especially delighted to welcome tonight Professor Michael Herb from the University of Georgia State, Atlanta, where he is a professor of political science. Professor Herb received his PhD from UCLA and is a recipient of numerous fellowships, among others, a Fulbright Fellowship at the American University of Kuwait. His research and many publications examine the Gulf monarchies, in particular the political development of monarchical regimes, as well as the so-called resource curse and Gulf politics more broadly. Professor Herb's book, All in the Family, Absolutism, Revolution and Democracy in the Middle Eastern Monarchies, for example, explored the monarchical tradition in the Middle East in its various facets, comparing the remarkable vitality and resilience of some forms of monarchism with other contemporary political orders. His second book, The Wages of Oil, Parliaments and Economic Development in Kuwait and the UAE, published in 2014 with Cornell University Press, was named one of the best books in political science on the Middle East by the Washington Post in 2014. Here, Michael Herb examines the political effects of oil on the development of democracy and the stability of monarchical power. While Kuwait and the United Arab Emirates are the primary empirical focus of the book, his perspective also reaches beyond the Gulf to other countries with substantial oil resources. As becomes clear, Professor Herb can be considered to be among the leading experts in the topic under discussion here tonight. So without any further ado, I shall now pass the microphone to him for what I'm certain will be a very stimulating presentation. Professor Herb, thank you very much for coming all the way from Georgia to be with us here tonight at NYUAD. We are very much looking forward to a talk on leadership and economic growth in the Gulf states. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that very, very kind introduction. And I'd like to thank the NYUAD Institute for inviting me here today to talk some about leadership and economic development in the Gulf. So I am going to use this as I'm going to talk about the project that Henriette is working on, which is about specifically the effect of political leadership on economic development. And I'm going to use that also to talk some about the work I did in Wages of Oil, my recent book, which is a comparison of Kuwait and the United Arab Emirates and some of the other Gulf monarchies in terms of the nature of their economic development and the effect of politics on their economic development. So political scientists usually are not very fond of explanations that focus on the idiosyncrasies of individual leaders. We tend to like explanations which are based on institutions or on long-standing economic structures, or, for example, the role of oil in politics. But when it comes down to the individual choices of leaders that depend very much on individual leaders, we tend not to have a lot of tools to understand those sorts of decisions. But at the same time, there's a lot of evidence that those decisions matter. So especially in some kinds of political regimes. So in Henriette's project, which is a really fascinating project on leadership and economic outcomes, works off of an interesting article, actually a sort of seminal article from 2005 by Benjamin Olken and Benjamin Jones on the impact that leaders have on economic growth. And what they find in their very nicely constructed argument in their article is that that leadership matters only in some kinds of regime types. So, for example, in democracies, the specific identity of the leader isn't all that. It doesn't have that much of an impact on economic outcomes, which they measure in terms of growth. But in non-democratic regimes, it does. And especially in non-democratic regimes in which the ruler is not constrained by a legislature. And this makes sense, right? It makes a certain amount of sense that individual characteristics will matter more or less depending on the degree of constraints on rulers. And all rulers are constrained in one way or another. But some are constrained more than others, and some are constrained more in some areas of action than in other areas. And when we have situations in which individuals matter, then we have to start looking at aspects of the individual. Things like, we are all better at some things than we are at others. We are all more interested in some things than we are at others. Some people have better judgment than others in different areas. So it is these things start to become important. Let me give a couple of examples just to sort of set the stage here, drawing on George Bush, so an American president. George Bush in domestic policy once tried to reform the American pension system, Social Security. He took a shot at it, completely failed. I mean, the constraints on an American president in terms of messing with the pension system are really, really powerful constraints. George Bush couldn't accomplish much there. On the other hand, George Bush did decide to invade Iraq in 2003. And this is a decision which, maybe one way of thinking about the impact that individual leaders can have is if we do a little thought experiment and ask ourselves, if it had been a different leader, would the result perhaps have been different? If it just had been a different person? So in terms of reforming the American pension system, I'm pretty darn sure it didn't matter which Republican held office, the pension system was not going to be reformed in the way that he wanted it to be. On the other hand, in terms of the 2003 invasion of Iraq, it is not at all clear to me that that was something that a different Republican president would have done. That was a decision that was made, and it had a really powerful impact. So I think, and it is a decision that could have been made differently by a different president in similar circumstances. And I think this illustrates a general point about constraints that rulers are under. Sometimes those constraints vary according to issue area, and sometimes they can have an enormous impact. And I think this is true of foreign policy. It's probably, in terms of foreign policy, also probably true of Gulf rulers. For example, the very activist Qatari foreign policy that we saw up until recently. Some of my colleagues tried to explain this in terms of basic Qatari national interests and so forth, and it had something to do with that, but it also had something to do with the person who was the leader of Qatar at the time, and it changed when he was no longer ruler. So I'm gonna, however, turn back to economic policy, and I'm gonna talk about three examples from the Gulf with a focus on Kuwait. But I'll talk about the Al Maktoum of Dubai. I will talk about Abdullah Salem, the Emir of Kuwait from 1950 until 1965. And then I'll have in my closing comments, I'll talk a little bit about Mohammed bin Salman Al Saud, the current crown prince of, or Wali Al Ahad of Saudi Arabia. So let me start just with a couple of comments on Dubai, which is probably the place that people immediately think of when they think of, in the Gulf, the impact of political leadership on economic development. And that's because I do think that if we apply this test, would things have been different with different leaders in Dubai? It's quite possible that things might have been different. Dubai, the Al Maktoum, a series of Al Maktoum rulers of Dubai going back to the very late 19th century, have sought to make Dubai into a thriving entrepôt, a center of trade, a place where people can come to do business and thrive and prosper. It has been and a series of capable rulers have carried out this policy with really some noticeable successes. Now, of course, there are some people have different political points of view on the nature of these successes, but nonetheless, in terms of what the Al Maktoum set out to do, they have had an enormous amount of success. It's contributed to the diversification of the UAE economy away from oil. Today, Dubai, they just came out with the recent airport rankings. And as someone from Atlanta, I follow these sometimes. Atlanta has the world's busiest passenger airport. Beijing has the second busiest passenger airport in the world. And the third busiest passenger airport in the world, according to the most recent rankings, is in fact in Dubai, which is an amazing accomplishment if you think about it. By political, I think that it wasn't inevitable that this was going to happen. This was a project of the leaders of Dubai to try to develop Dubai as an entrepôt, and they've successfully turned it into one of the main meeting places of the Eastern Hemisphere, sort of the crossroads of the Eastern Hemisphere. It's become a model for the rest of the Gulf. So now Qatar has its own very thriving national airline. Abu Dhabi does too. So it is an example which has had some real impact outside of the Gulf. The one thing that perhaps has not been achieved, and I'll come back to this in a little bit, is the issue of citizen participation in the private sector. So much of what's been done in Dubai has been done with foreign labor. So let me now switch to another ruler, Abdullah Salem of Kuwait, who I think who mattered in the development of Kuwait and arguably in the early development of the Gulf as a whole. And so I'll start with that with his impact on the development model, the early development model in the oil-rich states of the Gulf. He came to power in 1950. He ruled until 1965. Kuwait first exported large amounts of oil from 1946. So he came to power shortly after Kuwait became rich from oil. And he thus influenced the nature of the development of Kuwait. And he took it in a direction which, in retrospect, looks obvious, but perhaps wasn't as obvious as it might have been. Kuwait, when it received its oil wealth, started spending it on citizens in quite large amounts. So Kuwait built a welfare state, which provided and still provides education to citizens, healthcare to citizens, built out the infrastructure of Kuwait City with all the ring roads and the new neighborhoods and so forth, and started the tradition of employing citizens in public sector jobs, a tradition which still exists in Kuwait and, in fact, throughout the other, especially in Kuwait and, Qatar and the UAE, the other two really rich in per capita terms Gulf oil exporters, and also in Saudi Arabia and Oman and Bahrain to some degree as well. And this had a real influence on the rest of the Gulf. So this was done mostly in the 1950s, and as some of you perhaps might recall, Abu Dhabi, for example, didn't start really spending its oil wealth until 1966, when Sheikh Zayed came to power. and then he built out, both created the UAE as a confederation of 7 ruling families, and also built up from the ground floor pretty much, the Abu Dhabi and then the Emirati states. And it was done, I think, largely on the model of Kuwait, at least initially. So the education, healthcare, infrastructure, state jobs for citizens, all was sort of this Gulf model. And again, it seems sort of inevitable, but there's actually some of my colleagues have been doing work where they actually look at other oil-rich states in other parts of the world. One such oil-rich state is Equatorial Guinea, which is in the Gulf of Guinea in West Africa. And probably people don't talk a whole lot about Equatorial Guinea here, but it's a fascinating comparison case with the Gulf, because Equatorial Guinea has a lot of oil revenue per capita. It's rich, not quite as rich as the UAE, Kuwait, or Qatar, but richer than Oman, which has done a lot with its oil wealth over the past, since 1970. And in Equatorial Guinea, the rulers spend almost none of the wealth on citizens. They haven't built out a welfare state, hardly at all. Over time, people have looked at the place and been sort of horrified by the terrible health statistics in a rich country, and some pressure has been applied, but it clearly isn't something that the rulers found to be much of a priority. So it is possible, at least, that the building out of the what we might call the rentier state or the rentier state in the Gulf in the early days was more of a choice than we might imagine. There might have been alternate choices which would have resulted in different things. And since Abdullah Salem was the Emir of Kuwait in this period, perhaps he had some individual impact upon this. But let me talk about a second way in which his individual contribution is a little bit clearer. It is very clear. And this is the writing of the 1962 Constitution in Kuwait, which has had important economic impacts. I'll come to the economic impacts in a moment, but let me talk a little bit about the 1962 Constitution. It sets up the National Assembly in Kuwait, which is, by Gulf standards, a powerful political institution. It has specifically the right to remove confidence in ministers and even in the prime minister, which is to say, to remove them from office. And it can do this by a majority vote of the elected members of the National Assembly. And this is a power which does not have an equal in the other Gulf states. And it has, in recent years, been used by the National Assembly in Kuwait. Now, it's never actually voted someone out of office, but it's threatened to. And the threat has impelled a number of ministers over the years to actually leave office. And it actually forced a prime minister to resign in the formation of a new government a few years back. So, a country like Oman, for example, has elections which are reasonably free and fair, which is true also of Kuwait's elections. But in Oman, the elections aren't to a body which has the same level of political authority that the National Assembly in Kuwait does. And what I think this does, and I'll elaborate on this in a moment, but I think what this does is it empowers the Kuwaiti middle class, the middle class that works for the state in Kuwait in a degree to which is not the case in the rest of the Gulf. And that has some economic consequences along with political consequences. So let me go back for a moment to talk about the 1962 Constitution and how it was written. Well, to come back to this idea then of trying to understand the degree to which political outcomes result from the sort of pre-existing constraints on rulers, things that would have happened no matter who the ruler was, pretty much, and those which are a product of the particular inclinations of a particular ruler. And in this case, the 1962 Constitution was a product of both. Kuwait had a history, like some of the other Gulf states, of a legislative council and a strong merchant class. That mattered, although Kuwait isn't the only place in the Gulf where this is found historically. Kuwait wrote its constitution in 1962 the timing of it was quite clearly driven by a threat in 1961 to invade Iraq, a threat made by the leader of Iraq at the time. And when one looks at the timeline of what happened, it is very clear that the threat from Iraq to invade Kuwait sort of touched off and initiated the process of writing a constitution in Kuwait. And there's some very good reasons for that. I mean, it wouldn't happen in every country around the world, but it did happen in Kuwait. And this is because the particular problem that Kuwait had at the time, and keep in mind that Kuwait gained its independence in '61, whereas the other small Gulf states gained their independence later, a decade and more later. So in 1961, Kuwait's Iraq and other countries that weren't sympathetic to Kuwait or to Britain looked at Kuwait and said, how in the world does Kuwait deserve a seat in the United Nations? This isn't an independent state. This is what was said. I'm not. They said, Kuwait's a device, a creation of the British, and it's a ruling family with some oil fields. And you don't give a UN seat to a ruling family with oil fields. So again, I think it was more than that, but the goal of the Kuwaitis was to show that Kuwait was more than that. And one way to show this was to hold elections to a national assembly in which the citizens of Kuwait would be represented. And in that assembly, they could express support for the idea of an independent Kuwait and for the Al-Sabah, the ruling family of Kuwait, both of which Kuwaiti citizens were at the time quite willing to, they were strongly supportive of both. So the existence of the National Assembly was something which probably many rulers in a similar situation would have done, because it very clearly served the interests of Kuwait in attaining independence. And that was an important goal of not only the ruler of Kuwait, but also the citizens of Kuwait. But the actual content of that constitution and the nature of the National Assembly were not entirely a product of the Iraqi threat. And if we look at the minutes of there was an election held in Kuwait to a constitutional convention. At the constitutional convention, a committee was selected to write the constitution. And so 5 Kuwaitis, including a member of the ruling family, sat down and with the help of a couple of Egyptian advisors, wrote up the constitution. And they had some disagreements. Some of them wanted a more liberal constitution, and others, including Saad Abdallah, who is the member of the ruling family who was on the committee, wanted a somewhat less liberal constitution. And when they got into disagreements, they went to the emir and sought some guidance. And he tended to favor the more liberal sort of point of view. And that includes, for example, the provision that ministers can be removed from office, a no confidence vote in ministers, with a majority of the elected members of the National Assembly, not a 2/3 majority, which was the other possibility, and which would have created a very different National Assembly in Kuwait than the one that we have today. And when we look at why did Abdullah Salem err on the side of a more liberal constitution in Kuwait, it does appear to have something to do with his own personal politics. He had been the head of the 1938-1939 Majlis al-Tashri'i, or Legislative Council in Kuwait, which was a merchant council. He had good relations with Kuwait's merchant class, and he was kind of liberal. There is some agreement amongst Kuwaitis that he actually personally favored more political participation by Kuwaiti citizens. Now, he couldn't, not everyone in his family agreed with him. And in fact, most people in most other members of his family did not agree with him on this. And he came to power in 1950, and he wasn't able to put in place a fairly liberal, actually quite liberal constitution until 1962. And the situation that allowed him to do that was the threat from Iraq, which clearly in chronological terms was what precipitated it. But the end result owes something it owes something to Kuwait's traditions, it owes a lot to the Iraqi threat, and it owes a lot to the particular characteristics of the leader at the time, Abdullah Salem. And I think if we can imagine, again, we go back to this test. Would it have been different if it had been a different ruler in power? And I think there probably would have been a National Assembly. I think it would not have been a National Assembly with the authority that it has today. So let me talk a little bit about the consequences of this National Assembly, this strong National Assembly in Kuwait. And this comes back to economics. What the National Assembly in Kuwait does is it empowers the Kuwaiti middle class. The Kuwaiti middle class is, in the Gulf, especially in the richer Gulf states, in Kuwait, Qatar, and in the UAE, the citizen middle class tends to work for the state. Oftentimes up to 90% of citizens who work for a wage work in the public sector or in state-owned enterprises or in the oil company, but in state employment in one form or another. And Kuwait is the same. And this is a tradition that was established back in the early days of oil. One of the consequences of this, however, is that if we look at the relationship between the Kuwaiti middle class and business, especially private business in Kuwait, it is a very different relationship than one would find in a non-oil-based economy. So, for example, I am a professor of political science at Georgia State University in the state of Georgia. It's a public university. And it relies in part on tuition, but also in part from funds from the state of Georgia. So if the private sector economy in Georgia isn't doing well, then tax revenues aren't coming into the state, and then money doesn't come to the university, and then I don't get a raise, right? Now, if in fact the economy is doing well in Georgia, because it'll be driven by the private sector, then there will be money coming into the state. Some of it might go to the university system, and maybe, if they're so inclined, maybe I'll get a raise, right? But if if state revenues are going down, I'm not getting a raise no matter what. So I care about the private sector economy in the state of Georgia. Also for my children, when they get out of college, they'll go looking for a job. I hope there's a lot of jobs out there for them. In some place like Kuwait, and this has been noticed by Kuwaitis, members of the Kuwaiti National Assembly have pointed this out. In Kuwait, the private sector doesn't employ Kuwaitis. Kuwaitis work for the government. And the private sector doesn't pay taxes that then fund the salaries of the Kuwaiti middle class. So there's this sort of divorce between the private sector and the middle class in Kuwait, which is a product of both, well, it's a product of the nature, the sheer volume of oil wealth, right? Because the state does have enough money from oil alone to fund a welfare state and to employ most Kuwaiti citizens in the state. Just as a small aside, there are a fairly large number of Kuwaitis who work in the private sector in recent years. Many of them, however, receive their paycheck is from the government. So the government essentially pays them to work in the private sector. So I would count this as, I mean, that is government employment by a different name. And it doesn't change the underlying sort of dynamic at work here, which is a sort of a different relationship between Kuwaiti capitalists and the Kuwaiti middle class. So we can see some of the consequences of this if we look around at the policies, well, the nature of the Kuwaiti economy and the policies adopted by the National Assembly. The Kuwaiti economy is really utterly dependent upon oil. The amount of diversification in Kuwait is small. It has not had very much success in diversifying away from oil. The contrast with the UAE is really pretty stark. The UAE has had some real successes. I mean, again, third busiest passenger airport in the world. That's a real non-oil economy in the UAE, and this doesn't exist in Kuwait. The tourist industry in Kuwait is almost non-existent, and that's probably a good example to use to show some of the effects of having a national assembly. You know, if a Kuwaiti merchant, someone from the Kuwaiti merchant class or from the ruling family, or just an enterprising Kuwaiti wants to gather together some capital and build a hotel, a tourist hotel on one of the islands off of Kuwait City, you know, if they were allowed to do so, I expect that they could probably attract some tourists, perhaps. But that hotel, again, it would not pay taxes that would help the Kuwaiti middle class. It would not employ Kuwaitis in any significant numbers, except for at the very, very top. So it would benefit whoever owns the hotel. It'd be sort of a wash for Kuwaiti citizens. And in some ways, it would have some negative, potentially some negative impacts on Kuwaitis as well. One of the things that stops a tourist economy from emerging in Kuwait is in part the prohibition on alcohol, which it is a dry country across the board. So Kuwaitis just simply are not willing to make the adjustments that would be necessary for a tourist economy in Kuwait. Another example would be land. Early on, and this is something that Abdullah Salem did also, he established that land in Kuwait could only be owned by private citizens, and that also included members of his family, could only be owned within what are called the planning out borders of Kuwait. So essentially the built up areas of Kuwait City, which is only a small part of the country. So everything outside of that's owned by the state. And over time, owned by the state has come to mean that the National Assembly has a great deal of authority over what happens to that land. And the point of view of the National Assembly has been, it should just kind of stay in the hands of the people and not be alienated to private businesses. And so it's very difficult in Kuwait for private businesses to find land on which to build any project, much less something that has to do with tourism. We can also see, you can also tell some of the differences between Kuwait and, say, Qatar, the UAE, and Bahrain by looking at Google Maps. The other three countries have sort of large reclamation projects that go out into the Gulf, which are a product of their particular political economies. In Kuwait, there aren't any of these at all. Early on, the Corniche in Kuwait City was broadened out some. That was a reclamation project. More recently, someone got a hold of some land way down by the Saudi border. And if you look on Google Maps, it looks a little bit like, you know, something that you might see in Dubai or elsewhere with some, you know, villas on canals and so forth. But in the rest of Kuwait, there's none of this. That's all. And that's because the state does not allow private sector businesses or public sector businesses or anyone to go reclaiming land off of Kuwait City and then benefiting from it in one way or another. So it produces some remarkable differences from the rest of the Gulf. I think if we bring this back then to the argument made by the academic article I mentioned earlier by Jones and Olkin, who argue that leadership matters more in countries in which the ruler is less constrained. Well, I think what Abdullah Salem did in Kuwait was to be instrumental in creating a parliament which now constrains the rulers of Kuwait and makes it very difficult for them to follow the new Jumai model. It means that Kuwait is sort of stuck in this older model of Gulf economic development, one that it pioneered and one that has, again, a welfare state, education, health, and all of these other things for citizens. But Kuwait has not been able to follow the Dubai model of economic development that we see here. And I think this has a lot to do with the specific nature of the constraints on the ruler on the ruling family in Kuwait. So let me come back then and sort of mention a few of the few more aspects of the comparison with UAE. And there's different ways of evaluating this, the contrast depending upon what one, it's political science depending on one's politics, right? So it's always about politics. But I mean, one of the advantages that the UAE and especially the Dubai model has achieved is, again, exactly this economic diversification, which is something which is a real accomplishment, not just in the Gulf, but among oil states more generally. It is a core argument of economists that oil-rich states have a great deal of difficulty in diversifying their economies. The UAE has accomplished this. But the way it has done this is largely, however, with non-citizen labor. And so neither Kuwait nor the UAE, nor Qatar, nor really any of the Gulf states have made a lot of progress on solving the basic economic problem of figuring out how to make good use of citizen labor, especially in the private sector. Now, of course, citizens largely run these countries in the government sector, but the point of employment in the public sector is partly for the purposes of providing government services, but the goal isn't particularly a high level of efficiency. Citizens are hired mostly based on the reasonable fact that the main way that the country's oil wealth is distributed to citizens in the form of cash is through government employment. And so by employing more citizens, the wealth is spread more widely, which is if you compare it to Equatorial Guinea, is a laudable thing. But if you look at the issues of the efficiency of the use of citizen labor in the public sector, that again, it isn't really the point. I mean, people do lots and lots of work, but it's not that the decision to hire more citizens in Kuwait is not driven by the need for more citizens to do work, it's driven by the need to share out the oil revenue to citizens entering the labor market. In the private sector, of course, the private businesses prefer to hire citizens, as is well known for reasons that are, non-citizens are less expensive. But in neither, so the economic diversification we've seen in Dubai and in the UAE more generally has been largely an economic diversification of built on non-citizen labor. Now, there are some promising signs to some degree, and this would be in the use of citizen labor in state-owned enterprises, for example, which are quite, which do contribute to the diversification of Gulf economies in the UAE and elsewhere. And again, as Stefan Hertog has noted, some of the oil exporters have been quite successful in building state-owned enterprises which do employ citizen labor. The big exception to that, again, is Kuwait, which has been particularly not successful in building state-owned enterprises. So one can contrast the national carriers of Kuwait Airlines versus Etihad or Emirates or Qatar Airways, and the comparison is not in favor of Kuwait Airways, unfortunately. So there are some indications of using citizen labor in state-owned enterprises. But overall, the record in both countries has not been particularly positive. So with that, I want to turn to Mohammed bin Salman. And the Saudi Arabia faces a particular, a larger problem than do Kuwait, Qatar, and the UAE in terms of the employment of citizens in the private sector. Because as is also the case with Oman, the oil revenues per citizen are simply not as high as they are in Qatar, Kuwait, and the UAE. And those three states can keep going on their current trajectories for quite a while, I think, even with relatively low oil prices. Oil prices at $40 a barrel is hard, but I don't think, well, we'll see whether that's long-term, but even at a low price of oil, they can continue to employ citizens and provide a welfare state. Saudi Arabia needs to make some changes, and by the clear admission of the leadership in Saudi Arabia. And so Mohammed bin Salman he's an obvious case that sort of leaps to mind when one thinks about the issue of the impact of leadership on economic development. I mean, clearly here is a new leader, and again, he is the son of the king and the deputy crown prince, but he clearly has a great deal of authority and is using that authority to try to really by his own claim, he wishes to fundamentally transform the Saudi economy away from oil. And I think if we think about the issue of how balancing, the constraints that rulers face and the impact that a young, clearly energetic ruler or member of the regime can have on economic development, this is it'll be a really fascinating test. And I think one of the main tests will be the degree to which Mohammed bin Salman can in fact figure out how to productively use citizen labor in the private sector. Again, in Saudi Arabia, the private sector still largely relies on foreign labor. The trends, even in the past couple of years, even with mitakat, which is this system by which the Saudis have been trying to impel the private sector to employ citizens, even with that, the trend lines still are towards more employment of citizens in the state, and which has been outmatching growth in employment in citizens in the private sector, especially over the past, with the most recent numbers that have come out. So I think I was reading over this Vision 2030 plan, which he just released just a couple of days ago. So I was reading it in the airport, and it's a fascinating document, and there's some really good ideas in there, which a young and vigorous leader might be able to successfully pull off. I mean, things like promoting the mining in Saudi Arabia, things like making Saudi Arabia a crossroads of commerce, which is something that Dubai has shown is possible in this region, and Saudi Arabia has some advantages in. And of course, that part of that is this bridge that is going to be built to Egypt, or has been promised to be built to Egypt across those two, now I guess, well, across the two islands. Another one was tourism, and especially religious tourism, which is going back to way before oil, been a mainstay of the economy of the Hijaz in western Saudi Arabia. And certainly there are some things that could be done there as well by a ruler who really tries to shake things up. He's promised more transparency, and this would certainly be a good thing and hard to accomplish, but perhaps he could. But I think a lot of it comes down to also providing jobs. And it was interesting the degree to which Vision 2030 didn't talk about that as much. It didn't talk about the really difficult problem of one that neither Kuwait nor the UAE has entirely figured out, of figuring out how to promote economic diversification while still relying primarily on citizen labor in the diversified sectors of the economy. And so I think one way to measure the success of Mohammed bin Salman in his efforts to transform the Saudi economy will be also in the degree to which he transforms the Saudi economy and the role of citizen labor in that transformation.
I found it interesting you didn't use the word colonialism or the impact that colonial powers had at various stages in these countries, influencing leaders, influencing the development of countries, and even at times selecting certain leaders. And even when you spoke about Equatorial Guinea, it's very interesting that it is an exception in West Africa, not having been under French or British rule, but Spanish is the frequently spoken language there. I mean, I'm wondering if the Spanish colonial power, in that case, had an impact on the development, even contemporaneously. But let's go back to the Arab world, specific to leadership.
Yeah, I think, the impact of colonial powers has been great. Now, in Equatorial Guinea, you're absolutely correct. Spain was the colonial power. But the results, and the problem is we don't have multiple really rich African oil exporters. But in Gabon, there is a fair amount of oil, and the results have not been as good as they have been in some of the states in the Gulf, especially. So I'm not, and I think the jury's out on this, right? But certainly one of the factors that potentially is important is in fact colonial powers. And I wouldn't want to suggest that it's all up to the rulers. I mean, this is not true. But I do think that oftentimes our explanations put individual choices by rulers just sort of in a black box, and then we ignore them. And I don't think that's quite accurate either. But I do think you're absolutely correct that looking at the colonial legacy is a good place to start. Now, of course, in the Gulf, both in Abu Dhabi and in Oman, the British had a role in leadership choices early on. And so there are rulers who are much less enthusiastic about spending money, who were replaced by rulers who were more enthusiastic about spending money. And of course, that did benefit the British, who were at the time sort of the companies, had the companies that were likely to benefit. But it was, I think citizens of these countries also benefited from spending that oil too, for sure. So there was certainly a role. I mean, there's no doubt that the British favored rulers who would follow again, I think, something like the Dubai model. And but that, it is. I'm not sure I would say that was all such a bad thing in some ways. I mean, there's a book From Rags to Riches by an Abu Dhabi citizen who's Fahim, yeah, and he has a story in there which he describes his. I mean, it's a tragic story about being in Abu Dhabi before the first hospital was built, and his little sister got sick. And they had to try to get her to Dubai, and did not. I mean, it's a really sad story. And he uses it to illustrate the advantages of spending the oil wealth. And he really wished that there had been a hospital in Abu Dhabi at the time. And Sheikh Zayed built hospitals.
The fact that Dubai is oil poor, does it have anything to do with the fact that it went to more diverse economy as opposed to Abu Dhabi, which is oil rich, and all the economic enterprises actually is financed by this oil. So the diversification policy is more successful in Dubai simply because they don't have oil. It's not because of specific quality of certain leadership. That would be.
But I think that the thing, I agree with you that is important, but the thing is that if being relatively oil poor were enough, then there might be other states that also pursued successfully this sort of Dubai model of diversification. But it was Dubai that made it work, and made it work in the sort of grand sort of fashion that happen now. But I do agree with you, and it's the federal nature which I think is important, because Dubai doesn't have as much oil, but on its own, I mean, not nearly as much as Abu Dhabi, but on its own, it does have some, right? And one time when I looked, it looked like it wasn't so far off, like per capita terms, what Oman has, right? Not a lot, but still some, and not none. I mean, and Oman has put its oil revenues to good use, but Dubai, I think, took those revenues and invested them. And it makes a certain amount of sense within the context of the federation, because early on the Al Maktoum could, from the constitutional debates in the 1970s, when Sheikh Zayed wanted to move oil revenues to the federal level and strengthen the federal government, and that would have, made, his Abu Dhabi, it would have been, in many ways, I think it was perceived by the other Emirates as a potential kind of lowering their position. And so the way that the Al Maktoum managed to maintain relevance and maintain some is by diversifying the economy, and that helps balance out, or at least it did until the crisis, Abu Dhabi's oil revenues. So, but it's important that they're in the context of the UAE. It is still the case that in the UAE as a whole, about 90% of citizens work for the state. That's true throughout the entire country. So some oil revenues come to the other Emirates, enough to help fund the infrastructure and so forth. So, but it's a really interesting question, the sort of incentives created by the federal structure. But I still, and these are important. I don't want to be arguing that individual leadership is everything, right? But I think it's something. And I think it's something in Dubai as well. But not everything, for sure.
Yes, I'm not a political science student or background. I am an engineer with management experience. So I was looking for leadership as a topic.
Yes.
Now, I can see here that there is a strong correlation between leadership and economy. That is certainly the case. In Kuwait, there are different circumstances. You have to take into consideration that the decision-making became slow. So decision-making, when it became slow with the constitution, of course, jeopardized the economy overall and jeopardized the whole process, plus the war, of course, in 1990. We have to remember that there was a major crisis. And at the time, Kuwait was a leader in terms of creating this fund, which was very significant, like what we have here in Abu Dhabi, which is ADIA. I couldn't see any relationship between Georgia and the example in the Gulf. That is not relevant, because we have to also remember that there are cultural factors. At the time when this constitution was established, it was a growing economy. The difference between Georgia is a well-set state, and democracy that some of our colleagues said. Here we don't have that. The private-public partnership or integration did not exist at the time. The private sector was very weak, and there is no companies or strength for them to rely on themselves. So the public had to do something, and Abdullah Salim did the right thing to support them and to create jobs, etc., etc. So you cannot link this to the experience of the West with full respect because of the growing nature of the... So in conclusion, we have growing economies, which is different than the examples you said for Norway and the other one, and Georgia. And you look for diversification. There are other factors, as many of the colleagues said. So we have to take into consideration the cultural factors, the growing factors, the population, etc. Especially linking this to the what we call expat labors. You call it non-citizen. We call it here expat labors. I don't see that is relevant. All these countries, population-wise, they needed these guys. So where do they go? They have to find some place to recruit these growing economies. So we have to differentiate between a well-set economy and a growing economy. And we have to differentiate between cultural factors, and we have to differentiate between the understanding of democracy in all these places. But in conclusion, in Kuwait, the constitution made the things worse or slow down the things. That is my simple understanding. Thank you.
Well, let me respond to a few things. Of course, they are called expats, and citizens are called nationals. I use the phrase citizens and non-citizens mostly for other audiences who don't understand. I mean, in the book, I don't want to simply talk to a Gulf audience. And expat and national is phrases which are sort of, I've had people ask me what an expat is before. So, and that's not anything that happens in the Gulf. But turning to some of the other, I mean, the Georgia thing, my point is simply this. I care about what happens in the private sector in Georgia a lot. My personal income is directly dependent upon the success of the private sector in Georgia. And a university professor in Kuwait, some of whom I know, and their salaries are dependent upon the price of oil. The success of the private sector in Kuwait will not affect the amount of money that the government has available for their salaries. And arguably, it could even make it less. Because sometimes if say that tourist hotel were built and not taxed, it still imposes costs on the government for electricity, for water, for people who deal with the bureaucracy, the legalities of people coming in and out of the country and so forth, that imposes costs that aren't covered because it's not taxed. And so my argument here is simply about the incentives faced by the members of the citizen middle class, even members of the citizen middle, in contrasting the incentives faced by people in Kuwait versus by the Kuwaiti middle class versus the middle class in a non-oil economy. And I draw the comparison because we're all, I mean, again, non-Gulf audiences especially, but even people who look at the Gulf, I think, from outside and like the IMF and so forth, they bring these models to the Gulf which are drawn from other economies. And I think it's useful to sort of try to point out how some of the incentives are different. Another example of this is the fact, what's the purpose of state employment in the Gulf? If you come from outside the Gulf, you always think the purpose of state employment is to pay citizens for their labor. That is one purpose of state employment in the Gulf. The other purpose is to distribute the oil wealth. And if people, it's just absolutely crucial that people understand some of these differences, which is why I think sometimes comparisons with other economies work. And then your final point about Kuwait, I mean, I'm not sure I disagree with it. I mean, yeah, Kuwait has some problems in growing because of because of the National Assembly. I do think that however, there is an argument to be made that so again, the IMF, right? I know people, I don't mean to criticize the IMF too much. But sometimes the IMF will write these reports in which they measure the performance of Gulf economies based entirely on their growth rates. Okay, well, sure, I can understand this. For most economies, if there's economic growth, that's good. If there's less economic growth, that's bad. However, in the Gulf, oftentimes economic growth means that it can mean one of two things, right? Economic growth can be a result of the state spending more money, which is not necessarily good. I mean, there's an argument to be made that sometimes the states should save the money and save it for future generations and so forth. So, and the other thing that can lead to more economic growth in the Gulf is, again, the growth in the sort of expatriate-oriented economy in the UAE. And, again, there is an argument to be made that perhaps the Gulf states would be better off. I think that there are costs and benefits to that. So there's an argument to be made that the Gulf states would be better off by relying more on their own labor. So given that Kuwait has not developed a large sort of expatriate-oriented or non-citizen-oriented diversified economy, I think that Kuwait's development model should probably focus on citizens. I mean, everything else about the country is sort of focused on citizens. Why not limit the amount of non-citizen labor in the country, which would limit its growth rates? But the purpose of growth is not to I mean, just provide growth for the sake of growth. And it's also to build an economy which meets the needs of its citizens. And it isn't, but there's advantages to the UAE model too. It provides an enormous amount of jobs and a chance at the middle class for a large number of people, of immigrants, of expatriates, many of them from poor countries. And that's a real accomplishment. I mean, there is, the South Asian middle class here is thriving, and it provides some real benefits. And the UAE is a catalyst for economic development elsewhere, and that's a real accomplishment. But they're sort of weighing the interests of citizens and the interests of everyone else in a context in which, and as someone who studies the Gulf, in a context in which people from the outside often just don't get these trade-offs at all. They just don't. They don't get them at all. Sorry.
Shane, bringing your topic of taxes in Georgia.
Yeah.
The one thing coming to the GCC in 2018 is VAT.
Yes.
Specifically taxes.
Yep.
And taxes will be trying to kind of help governments diversify away solely from oil.
Yeah.
And a lot of economists are expecting the GDPs to not shrink, but not grow as quickly as they were in the past with
Yep.
VAT.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on kind of the
My-
impact of tax on political systems?
My thought on the impact of a VAT in the Gulf, let's just take Kuwait as an example where there isn't a diversified economy. The Kuwaiti economy works, as you know, the money comes into the state, it goes out in various budget lines to citizens, to capital expenditures. A VAT, what it's going to accomplish is the state spends it all, and then it grabs some of it back, right? And then it just spends it again. It doesn't diversify the economy. It's just it's like when people come to the Gulf and they recommend an income tax, right? Well, for most Kuwaitis, say, I'm going to use the Kuwaitis as an example, what's an income tax? An income tax just is a wage cut, right? Because you could accomplish it much more directly by simply taking the wages of Kuwaiti citizens and just cutting them a little bit, right? Or you could call it a tax, and it has exactly the same impact. So I think the VAT is a fine idea. And I think in an economy like this one, it is crucially important that the UAE tax what's going on in the diversified sector to make sure that it's not being subsidized by oil revenues. At some point, it's got to pay for itself, right? Otherwise, the whole thing is just on a downward. But I think it can pay for itself. I think that there is a real economy here. So a VAT makes a lot of sense in that context, of the context of the UAE. In the context of Kuwait, it's just redistributing money from one place to another. And there's maybe something to be said. There's also something to be said for taxes on rich Kuwaitis as well, because some of that money sort of collects in different parts of the private sector economy, and maybe tax some of it back.
One thing I forgot to mention, sorry, excuse me. Can we say maybe at the end, as a conclusion for the audience, that single effective leadership may work better than constitutional leadership in the growing economies? Thank you.
The argument is that leaders have an impact in non-democratic, non-parliamentary regimes. The direction of that impact, however, is not always going to be in the positive direction. There's something. One of the advantages of a government, which is even with the United States as an example, one of the advantages of government which has leaders who can't just go do whatever they want, is precisely that sometimes you don't want leaders to go just do whatever they want, right? So we have constraints on leaders for sometimes good reasons, and if that produces, in some cases, less economic growth than might be possible if you just give a whole lot of power to a really gifted leader, I'm fine with that. That's okay.